I can inform you that the Australian Labor Party's vote is at the lowest level in more than 100 years.
It's September the 7th, 2013. In 11 days, Tony Abbott and his new ministry will be sworn into government. But 917 kilometres away, the outgoing Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, bids farewell.
A short time ago, I telephoned Tony Abbott to concede defeat at these national elections. As Prime Minister of Australia, I wish him well now in the high office of Prime Minister of this country.
For context, when Rudd first became Prime Minister, this was how his Labor government dominated Parliament. In fact, Rudd was so dominant that the Liberals cycled between leaders. First was Brendan Nelson, and then there was Malcolm Turnbull. But Turnbull's leadership was constantly in question.
You've said Malcolm Turnbull is the best person to lead the Liberal Party at the moment, but he's having a terrible time in the polls. What's the one piece of advice he should take from this book to improve the whole party's standing?
In 2009, Abbott himself would take over, and in just over 3 years, he changed the Parliament from looking like this to looking like this. But here's the crazy irony. Despite completely destroying Labor in the 2013 election, Abbott wouldn't live to see the next one. Unlike Nelson, Turnbull wasn't content with retiring after losing the party leadership. After all, Abbott was an old foe.
The thing that worries me about what Malcolm said this morning is the intolerance of it all. I mean, why shouldn't the Liberal Party be able to stick up for its principles, and why shouldn't Labor MPs who believe in the Constitution be able to do so?
But if Turnbull were to stand any chance of getting revenge, Abbott would need to drop the ball badly. And given that Labor had suffered one of its worst defeats, surely Abbott's goodwill would far outlast the threat of Turnbull, right? Statistically, Abbott might have been the greatest ever opposition leader. So where did it all go wrong?
We have lost 30 news polls in a row.
So the Abbott chapter of Australian history was really born out of a word that my Year 6 class was forced to learn at our Canberra excursion in 2009, the emissions trading scheme. But not once did I ever actually understand what this was. So what on earth was the ETS? Well, back when Kevin Rudd was elected in 2007, one of his most notable quotes was this:
Climate change is the great moral challenge of our generation.
Now, in 2008, Rudd was far too occupied with the GFC to act on this, but in 2009, he spelled out exactly how he would have Australia help tackle climate change. Now, during my teaching degree, we were taught to always use positive rather than negative reinforcement in the classroom. Now, technically that's not true. You probably want to go for about an 80-20 ratio, but you get the point. And so rather than mandating businesses reduce their carbon, an emissions trading scheme instead allowed businesses to profit from reducing their carbon by having it tradable on the private market. Let me show it to you. Let's just say the government wanted to cap CO2 output at 100 million tonnes for the year. With an emissions trading scheme, 1,000 of the biggest firms in Australia would be given an allocation of 100,000 carbon permits. If, say, Woolies went over their allocation, they would have to buy permits off of another company that had them in excess, incentivizing companies to keep their carbon output down. Now, with this policy, some simply win more than others. For massive mining companies like Rio Tinto and BHP, they were never getting anywhere near falling under the cap, and so they'd be spending a lot of money on buying permits off of others. Now, when it came to the Liberals under Turnbull, their initial policy was to actually support the ETS throughout 2009. I mean, just have a look at Abbott's begrudging support right here.
To not oppose something is not the same as to support something. You are not obliged to fight at all times on all issues.
Though Abbott was technically supporting Turnbull's decision to support the ETS, throughout 2009, Abbott's criticism became more and more vocal.
If you want to put a price on carbon, why not just do it with a simple tax?
So, as pressure mounted within the Liberal Party, Turnbull tried to get more concessions from Rudd, such as $4 billion in compensation for polluting industries. Now, remember the layout of the 2007 Parliament I showed you before? The opposition wasn't just made up of Liberals, but also their coalition partner, the Nationals. By November, the Nationals outright came out against the ETS.
I understand where Malcolm is coming from and that he wants to try and mitigate it. We too would support amendments to try and tone down the ridiculous aspects of this tax. But we can't endorse it, because endorsing the proposition is endorsing the premise that Mr. Rudd can cool the planet.
So by November, the pressure was really mounting on Turnbull, and many within the party actually wanted him to oppose the ETS. Now, I'm not a huge Turnbull fan here, but to give him his dues, he well and truly stood his ground.
Putting his political career on the line, the opposition leader made the threat this morning, saying he would hand over his leadership of the Liberal Party if they refused to support his stance on negotiating amendments on the ETS.
On the 1st of December 2009, Turnbull followed through and allowed a contest for the leadership. On the ballot was Turnbull, a supporter of the ETS, Abbott, an opponent of the ETS, and then lastly the favourite, Joe Hockey, who was also a supporter of the ETS. Unbelievably though, in the first round of votes, Hockey was eliminated, receiving just 23 votes compared to Turnbull's 26 and Abbott's 35. Still, Hockey supporters would surely vote for Turnbull after the second ballot, right? Well, most did, but crucially not all of them. On the second ballot, Turnbull picked up 41 votes, but Abbott picked up 42. Yeah, it was that close. But if you're good at maths, you might actually notice that there was more votes in the first ballot than in the second. That's because someone simply just voted no in the second ballot. But regardless, Abbott was now in, and he sure had his supporters in the Conservative faction of the party.
And Tony Abbott has the very important capacity to talk to both ends of town. He's a politician, he's a firefighter, a lifesaver, a bike rider, a joker, a sportsman and a scholar. Few have come to political leadership with such worthy credentials. And the Labor Party in their heart of hearts know that this is one person they will not be able to afford to take for granted.
Now, upon coming to office, Abbott immediately teamed up with the Greens, who ironically felt that the ETS didn't go far enough. Together in the Senate, they had the numbers to stop it from becoming law. Now, there are very few people that I think would actually make better opposition leaders than Tony Abbott. I can only really think of Paul Keating and Jack Lang. Quite interestingly, Abbott actually came into Parliament as Keating was leaving. This was what Keating had to say about their crossover period.
He turned up in the last couple of years when I was Prime Minister. I regard him as a sort of resident nutter on their side, you know.
Now, Abbott had always been a political figure. While studying economics at uni, Abbott became enamoured with B.A. Santa Maria, a faction boss within the Labor Party who vehemently opposed communism. When Labor expelled him from the party, he started a new party called Democratic Labor. Abbott also studied during the dismissal of Gough Whitlam and organised rallies in favour of John Kerr for firing him. However, by the end of the 1970s, the Democratic Labor Party had just about collapsed, and Abbott was left with no political allegiance. Instead, a different path loomed for Abbott, the priesthood. But after starting his studies, Abbott described himself as a square peg in a round hole and left. By all accounts, Bob Carr nearly coaxed him into joining Labor, but he was too uncomfortable with unions. Instead, it would be the monarchy debate that would nail him to the Liberals. I mean, just listen to the way that Turnbull describes the monarchist opposition to Keating's call for a republic.
You seem to believe that the Liberals' position is really not so much, in some cases, anti-Republican as anti-Keating.
Oh, I think it is. I think what it is this pathetic, moronic, knee-jerk reaction that you get oppositions have in Australia, and it's not just Liberal oppositions, that whatever the government, if the government says white, the opposition says black.
In 1994, Abbott entered Parliament, winning the safe seat of Warringah in a by-election. When Howard took government off of Keating, Abbott slowly accrued power within the party.
I mean, we've got bulk billing rates up. We're increasing nursing home places.
But as 2009 ended, 2010 would prove to be an extremely difficult year for Rudd. Unable to pass his ETS, Rudd controversially decided to scrap the policy for the time being. And just have a look at the two-party preferred vote. When Abbott took over, this was the difference. But by May, the gap was entirely closed and the knife sharpened in the Labor Party. Now, the coup against Rudd happened for a number of factors. You've got the disgruntled members at Rudd's management style, you've got the scrapping of the ETS, you've got pro-US senators like Mark Arbib conspiring against him, and then very crucially, you have the introduction of the mining tax. Essentially, Rudd proposed a 40% tax on the mining industry, and in response, the mining lobby ran $22 million worth of ads like this.
Some people would have you believe that only miners are concerned about the new mining tax. I'm not a miner, but I am concerned.
Under too much pressure from within, Rudd stepped down and Gillard became the leader, immediately calling an election.
This morning, I asked Her Excellency, the Governor-General, to dissolve the House of Representatives so that elections can occur for the House and half of the Senate on Saturday, August 21.
Abbott's messaging was simple but clear. They can change the leader, but Labor cannot change their DNA. This was the party of reckless spenders and high tax. Still, Rudd's 2007 landslide certainly kept Labor as definite favourites. For instance, Centrebet had them at $1.40 while the Libs were at $2.90. Unbelievably though, as election night came to an end, Labor hadn't won.
Whoever would have thought we'd all wake up this morning with no idea who'll be running the country for the next 3 years. Prime Minister Julia Gillard or Prime Minister Tony Abbott? We're no closer to an answer than we were this time last week. It could be days, maybe even weeks before we have a decision.
I actually remember this election as a 12-year-old really well. There was a real theatre to this election that I don't really remember any of the others. And look, I wasn't a particularly political kid, but hey, Abbott had charmed me. And so I was looking at what the polling data was like in, I don't know, say Latrobe, to see if he could get over the line. But once the results were finalised, it became clear that neither side had the magic number of 76 to form a majority, both falling 4 seats short. There were 6 seats held by non-major parties, and so Abbott and Gillard began negotiations. Now, before the election, this Greens MP, Adam Bandt, said he'd support Labor in a hung parliament, so Labor moved to 73. One of the independents, Andrew Wilkie, was an ex-Greens member and followed suit, so now Gillard had 74. However, this party, the WA Nationals, supported Abbott to bring the Libs up to 73, and so that left 3 more seats: Bob Katter, Tony Windsor, and Rob Oakeshott. Now, these guys used to be Nationals, meaning that you would expect them to go for Tony Abbott, but instead, they basically said, give us your best offer. Indeed, Katter announced his support for the coalition, taking them to 74, but Windsor and Oakeshott supported Gillard, giving her the magic 76. Gillard didn't just need to negotiate the lower house, but she actually fell well short in the Senate. Have a look at this. In the Senate, you need 39 seats to have a majority. Labor only held 31, while the Greens held 9. It was in the Senate that the Greens had killed the ETS, and so Gillard was very cautious of getting the Rudd treatment. In the end, she made a deal with the devil. Greens voters will hate me calling them the devil here, but while winning the support of the Greens, she gave Abbott the keys to the kingdom and the cheat codes to take her down.
I and Wayne Swan signed on behalf of the Australian Labor Party an agreement with the Australian Greens. Of course, we have been working in negotiations with the Greens, with the Independents, with Mr Andrew Wilkie and with Mr Tony Crook to seek to form stable and effective government.
In the deal, both the lower house leader Adam Bandt and the upper house leader Bob Brown secured weekly meetings with Gillard where ultimately they pressed her into a carbon tax. Now, me using the word carbon tax is a little controversial because it also functioned as a fund for renewable energy. But with the carbon tax, 500 of the biggest polluters were to pay $23 per tonne of carbon pollution. What was a bigger issue though was that during the election campaign, Gillard famously said this.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead. What we will do is we will tackle the challenge of climate change.
This is the greatest betrayal, the greatest breach of faith.
Since when does one vote trump 149 votes unless the real Prime Minister of this country is Senator Bob Brown?
Of course, Abbott vowed to end the carbon tax, but he then set his sights on another one, the mining tax. So, like I said before, Rudd proposed a 40% tax on the profits of the wealthiest mining companies, but he didn't live long enough to see it through. Now, given that Labor had accused John Howard of doing relatively little to capitalise on the mining boom, Gillard couldn't do nothing. But she also wanted to avoid incurring the wrath of the Minerals Council. What we saw as a compromise was a really watered down version of the mining super profits tax. The Minerals Resource Rent Tax was originally designed as a tax that would only be paid after companies made $50 million in profit, but Gillard was talked into making the threshold $75 million, exempting around 320 companies. Not only that, but rather than being a 40% tax, it was taken down to 30%. This meant that the tax only brought in $200 million as opposed to the projected $3 billion. As an advocate for the mining companies back in 2009, Abbott remained scathing about both of these taxes.
The whole argument for a carbon tax is lie after lie after lie.
Tony Abbott seeking to end the session with a censure, and it got very personal.
Now, Mr Speaker, she turns her back.
And probably the last prong to Abbott's attack on Gillard was a phrase that many Australians would remember: stop the boats. So the asylum seeker issue was a tricky one that saw a number of different approaches. The first approach was something called offshore processing, where Howard would subject seafaring migrants to harsh offshore processing camps in Nauru and Manus Island in Papua New Guinea in order to deter others from trying to catch a boat to Australia. When Rudd became Prime Minister, he dismantled offshore processing for lack of ability to have proper oversight over conditions. Instead, Christmas Island, an Australian territory, was chosen as the processing centre. However, with this came an increase of seafaring migrants. So Gillard then once again changed tact and proposed a deal where Australia sent asylum seekers to Malaysia, and in exchange, Malaysia sent processed refugees. However, the High Court struck this down. For me, Abbott was an absolute beast at exploiting this issue. I mean, just look at the way that he doesn't even let Koshy concede the most non-controversial of points.
In Australia.
Yeah, those people smugglers, I think everyone agrees, are the scum of the earth and are just preying on people in dire need.
But you see, the government has put them back in business. The government has put them back in business, Koshy, by giving them a product to sell.
Eventually, Gillard relented and reopened Manus Island, but by that point, the damage had been done. Going into the 2013 election, Gillard was predicted to lose about 32 seats. Remember, that's 32 Labor MPs who are going to be without a job, and so in their desperation, they returned to the man who had once delivered 83 seats, Kevin Rudd. Now, Rudd fought valiantly and saved as many as 15 seats for the Labor Party, but by this point, there was no way he was beating Abbott, and in September, Abbott claimed victory.
I can inform you that the government of Australia has changed for just a second.
So remember Abbott's 3 immediate points: carbon tax, mining tax, stop the boats. Well, immediately, Abbott got to work in repealing those taxes.
The Australian people have pronounced their judgment against the carbon tax. They want it gone. And this bill delivers. It delivers on the Coalition's commitment to the Australian people to scrap this toxic tax.
With those two done pretty much straight away, Abbott turned his attention to stopping the boats, launching a new naval operation.
As soon as we are sworn in, we'll commence Operation Sovereign Borders. That will start making a difference from day one.
There's probably 2 things to emphasise about Operation Sovereign Borders. The first was that seafaring migrants were now labelled illegal rather than irregular. And the second was that there was a zero tolerance policy. In other words, if you get caught, you will face harsh offshore detention. I mean, just have a look at the words of the then Immigration Minister, Scott Morrison.
You have been brought to this place here because you have sought to illegally enter Australia by boat. The new Australian government will not be putting up with those sorts of arrivals. If you choose not to go home, then you will spend a very, very long time here.
So I actually went to high school in ScoMo's electorate, and one time he gave a speech to our school, and I kid you not, as far as my recollection remembers, he started the speech with, "Sorry I'm late, a boat just arrived." Bear in mind, he's talking in front of apolitical students and one of the most unionised workforces out there. It didn't go down so well. Morrison also introduced something called the Migration and Maritime Power Amendment, which legalised deporting seafaring refugees back to their home country. This was particularly controversial when 37 Tamil Sri Lankans escaped at the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War. The Sri Lankan army was accused of massacring and raping Tamils, but Morrison made the controversial call to return them home. So, having taken action on his 3 immediate concerns, Abbott turned his attention to what he claimed were structural issues in Australia. Remember, it was the connection to the unions that turned Abbott away from Labor in the 90s, and so he launched a royal commission into corruption within the unions.
And the only reason why they don't like one particular dodgy union official is because she was a whistleblower. She was a whistleblower. So it's not dodgy conduct by union officials that they're against, it's whistleblowing by union officials that they're against.
So obviously I'm all for exposing corruption in whatever the institution is, and if that's what I thought this investigation was about, then I'd be all for it. But the Royal Commission didn't really find much. Of the entire commission, only 40 were referred for criminal charges with just 1 conviction. A dude from the CFMEU was sentenced to a $500 good behaviour bond for destroying documents that were later found to be irrelevant to the commission. The commission cost $45.9 million. But this was actually much less than the $200 million of annual revenue that was lost because of the mining tax, and then the $7.6 billion of revenue that was lost because of the carbon tax. Remember, one of Abbott's promises was that he would put the budget back into surplus and that Canberra would make more revenue than they spend.
Tony Abbott wasn't the happiest little Vegemite when pressed about his shifting time frame for a budget surplus.
It will happen sooner and more effectively under us. It's very hard for us to say precisely when things are going to happen.
So going into the 2014 budget, Abbott had cut a number of key revenue streams that the Liberals were actually facing a $48.5 billion deficit in May. For perspective, Labor's so-called reckless spending in 2013 resulted in an $18.8 billion deficit. As a side note, I don't think this is a good metric of economic management. In some seasons, like the GFC, you actually want to spend more money than you make to avoid really bad unemployment. However, of course in others you want to hold more than you spend to avoid really bad inflation. If you are a long-term viewer, allow me to ride my hobby horse once again. What's much more important than a surplus is a structural surplus, i.e. if left alone, does the money you spend pay itself off in the long term, like investing in, say, education? However, Howard had redefined economic success to being as simple as either being in the red or being in the black, and so Abbott had to work with that premise. And quite simply, there was no way that Abbott could go into the 2014 budget with a deficit that was double of what was Labor's. And so if Abbott wasn't going to generate more revenue by increasing taxes, the only other way to reduce the deficit was to limit the expenses, which for a government are its services. This isn't exactly an easy sell to the nation, and so Abbott and his treasurer Joe Hockey went really hard on the line that we've got to cut the credit card.
Last night's budget was tough, but I think it was fair because we couldn't go on paying the mortgage on the credit card.
Yeah, I told everyone it was Rudd's fault for giving everyone $900, and now we're having to pay the price.
We are trying to fix the budget. Now, we can stand back and watch the house burn down, or we can actually do things that ensure that our country has a sustainable and affordable quality of life.
In terms of how they tried to make up some of the revenue, foreign aid was slashed by $7.6 billion, welfare was made unavailable to those under 25, it was frozen for 6 months for those between 25 and 29, the pension was pushed back, there were cuts to schools and hospitals, and some new revenue came in by Hockey increasing the fuel tax and selling $5.6 billion of shares in Medibank, our biggest health insurer. The net result was that the deficit was brought down to $29.9 billion, which was still over $10 billion bigger than Labor's 2013 deficit. Despite Abbott making full use of the credit card line, he really needed an economic win, and so he turned to China.
China has always viewed Australia as an important partner. During my visit, the two sides have decided to elevate our bilateral relations into a comprehensive strategic partnership.
So our most recent memory of a Liberal government's approach to managing China was very much a hostile one. However, we've got to remember that Abbott was in before COVID, before the Hong Kong protests, and before Trump's trade war. In other words, there was far less political capital to gain by being hostile to China, and far more money to lose. So have a look at this graph of the mining boom in Australia and compare it to the GDP of China. As China grew in economic strength, Australia found a market to export all its minerals to. To put it simply, the Minerals Council, who were huge fans of Abbott, were extremely dependent upon good relations with China. For context, in the 2013 election, they donated $2.847 million to the coalition, which was about 81% of its campaign donations. So in 2014, President Xi Jinping came out to Australia to participate in the G20 summit before visiting Sydney, Tasmania, and Parliament House. Abbott was so congratulatory toward Xi that he even said this.
I have never heard a Chinese leader declare that his country would be fully democratic by 2050.
Eventually, the two struck up a free trade deal with one massive issue. Under the CHAFTA agreement, companies that were at least 50% Chinese owned in Australia were able to import Chinese labour, but Australia had no such privileges in China. Abbott also struck up free trade deals with Japan and South Korea, calling the 21st century the century of Asia. He even went as far as beginning negotiations with Japan to have them build a multi-billion-dollar fleet of Soryu-class submarines to replace the outgoing Collins-class. But Abbott's foreign policy was more than just a couple of free trade side quests. In fact, he actually tried to force the hand of Obama. So during the War on Terror, America had removed Saddam Hussein from Iraq. Now, Iraq is kind of three countries within one country. On the west are Sunni Arabs, of which Saddam was one. In the north you have Sunni Kurds, and to the east you have Shiite Arabs. It's these guys who make up the slim majority of Iraq. And so when Iraq became a democracy, power transitioned into the hands of these guys. When Obama was finishing withdrawing US forces in 2011, radical Sunni groups rose up against the Shiite government. At the same time, 2011 saw the Arab Spring, where there was a string of revolts against authoritarian governments over here. Revolutionary fervour sprung up in Syria, next door to Iraq, and a radical group capitalised, trying to seize control of both Iraq and Syria. Abbott tried to use France and Britain to pressure America into deploying more troops and making a concerted effort to kill the leaders. In the end, Abbott settled for allowing 1,300 US Marines to be deployed to Darwin, continuing Gillard's policy of allowing US soldiers on Australian soil. By the way, I haven't used the name of that militant group because YouTube would certainly demonetize me. I'm wanting to go full-time real soon, but if that's going to be sustainable, AdRev won't even come close to covering a full year's worth of bills. So I could sell you a product that you wouldn't care for, like, I don't know, HelloFresh or something, or I could point you in the direction of something that I think you'd actually appreciate knowing about. If you're watching this, I'm guessing you've at least got some interest in Australian politics, but you might not know how we got here. And quite frankly, it really is just too overwhelming to know where to begin. But we've got you covered. You can become an expert in over 10 Prime Ministers in just 10 hours. We've got lectures, but we've also got revision activities to consolidate your learning. One of our takers even said this. Just click the link in the comments, it'll take you straight there. Get around it, it's good fun. So the big scandals that Abbott faced were all to do with personnel issues. Most of you watching would know this woman right here, Peta Credlin.
Now the ACT is the home of woke.
Well, Credlin had actually cut her teeth in the Howard government, and when Abbott came to power, became his chief of staff. For anyone who's watched The West Wing, she'd be the equivalent of Leia.
I'm recommending you include Iran in the attacks.
General Alexander went ahead with plans for these bombings.
At your request.
Now, there was no real scandal, apart from the obvious implication, but it was clear that Credlin had much more influence over policy than elected backbenchers. In meetings, Credlin would often speak quite forcefully to those backbenchers and demand that they fall in line on issues they didn't really have any say over. If enough of those backbenchers united together, a revolt from within the party could easily take place. But the second scandal to face the government was to do with a woman called Bronwyn Bishop.
A helicopter trip from Melbourne to Geelong that cost taxpayers $5,000 has landed Parliamentary Speaker Bronwyn Bishop in hot water.
What the Sigma? There's no way Bronwyn Bishop actually took a chopper to Geelong.
So for those unacquainted, this is the distance from Melbourne to Geelong. The Speaker of the House, Bronwyn Bishop, took a $5,000 taxpayer chopper ride for what only takes an hour to drive. There were calls for Abbott to fire Bishop, but he refused, instead saying that she was on probation.
I accept that people are very unhappy about this issue. They are entitled to be unhappy about this issue. Bronwyn is, I think, very, very contrite about this. I've had a couple of long conversations with her about it, and I think all of us can learn this lesson, but my priority today is to get on with providing the best possible government for our country.
The final big issue of PR was what was called the Nightmare Scandal. So under Gough Whitlam, knighthoods were discontinued in 1976. However, in 2014, Abbott had brought them back on the eve of Australia Day 2015, made the decision to knight Prince Philip.
Well, I'm really pleased that the Queen has seen fit to award knighthoods in the Order of Australia to Prince Philip for his very long life of duty and service.
Those backbenchers that I mentioned before were really blindsided by this, and trouble was starting to brew for Abbott.
Campbell Newman's unpopularity here in his own electorate is growing, and that he could be in trouble. A Galaxy research poll published in this morning's Courier Mail puts the Premier's primary vote at 42% compared to Labor candidate Kate Jones's at 48%.
So the early 2010s was a crazy period for Queensland. In 2012, Campbell Newman led the Liberals to a 78-7 victory over Labor. However, going into the 2015 election, it actually looked like Newman could lose that landslide majority. Now, Newman was unpopular for his own reasons. He basically slashed public spending to instead give that money to coal companies, and in doing so, nearly destroyed the Great Barrier Reef. But what was really interesting was that the Queensland LNP made the call that having Abbott campaign for Newman would be extremely counterproductive and actually asked him not to come to Queensland. So with an election round the corner, keeping Abbott could really badly damage the prospects of Queensland MPs keeping their job. One of those who became truly concerned was a guy called Andrew Laming, a Liberal from the eastern suburbs of Brisbane. Laming was a backbencher and so also carried the frustration of having far less influence than the unelected Peta Credlin. Laming actually joined forces with the guy called Luke Simpkins, and in February of 2015, Simpkins called for a spill.
Yes, I have called for the spill motion.
The hand grenade lobbed after midday Eastern Time from the west.
There was a massive issue though. Normally with leadership spills, there's a candidate who's directly challenging for the leadership of the party, but not in this instance. Some had approached Turnbull asking for him to throw his name in the hat, but Turnbull quashed this. If he didn't have the numbers, it would be the end of his political career. So essentially what this meant was that there was something called the empty chair spill. Either you voted for Abbott or voted for the empty chair. Look, Abbott obviously won, but not by the margin you'd think. 61 people supported the leader, but 39 voted for the empty chair, most of which we assume were backbenchers. Abbott promised that he'd consult the backbenchers more closely, but made what I can only describe as a purely stupid comment by saying that good government starts today, totally implying that his government wasn't already good. But Abbott lived to survive another day and pressed on with the task of preparing for the 2016 election. But Abbott actually wouldn't live to see that day.
Scott was loudly proclaiming his loyalty to Tony Abbott and at the same time organising his supporters to vote for me. And we had an understanding that if I became Prime Minister, he would be Treasurer.
Now, some of you guys have been asking me for my opinion on ABC's Nemesis. That was the bit that I just showed you. To be honest, there wasn't much in the Abbott episode that wasn't already covered in this low production value 15-minute video I did in 2023. Most of it's just filled with the same coworker complaints you get in the corporate world. That being said, I did go out on a limb in 2023 saying that I thought that Morrison was behind Abbott's demise in 2013. And I actually think that Nemesis confirmed that. Now, installing Turnbull as the leader wasn't going to be an easy exercise because at any point, Abbott could call for an early election against Shorten. Even Rupert Murdoch had tweeted that Abbott was the best leader in the coalition, and so many interpreted that as bait to call for the early election. However, if an early election was to be called, there was a very real chance that Abbott could go out in one term the same way that Newman did. If Turnbull was to make a move, he needed to know he had the numbers, and this is where Scott Morrison proved to be really helpful. Officially, Morrison walked away from the 2015 leadership spill with a lot of honour. He stayed loyal to Abbott by voting for him and honoured his friend Joe Hockey by not accepting Abbott's last minute offer to replace him as deputy leader. But unofficially, Turnbull is adamant to this day that Morrison had his supporters backing him rather than Abbott because Turnbull had made Morrison a promise that he would make him treasurer. This is what ScoMo said about it.
No, I don't recall Malcolm offering me treasurer before. I don't recall that.
This is something I think you definitely remember. And so if Turnbull wasn't telling the truth, then this would be awful slander about Morrison, and surely Morrison would have disavowed this in much stronger terms. James McGrath also seemed to confirm that Morrison was organising numbers for Turnbull.
I was getting phone calls from various, what you'd call, warlords from New South Wales who were pushing the need for Tony to go. There's no way that I would be receiving phone calls from those individuals in New South Wales unless they were doing that with the approval of their political master. It's as simple as that.
And that master was Scott Morrison.
I assume that their master is Scott Morrison.
So in September of 2015, Turnbull was confident that he had the numbers and just needed a just cause to pull the trigger. Unfortunately, the cause that he'd give would horribly come back to bite him.
Well, thank you very much. A little while ago, I met with the Prime Minister and advised him that I would be challenging him for the leadership of the Liberal Party. We have lost 30 news polls in a row. It is clear that the people have made up their mind about Mr. Abbott's leadership.
So Turnbull came in, winning 54 to 44, Morrison became the treasurer, and Abbott was relegated to the backbenches.
There'll be no wrecking, no undermining, and no sniping. I've never leaked or backgrounded against anyone, and I certainly won't start now.
However, in quite an interesting epilogue to the story, Abbott would end up getting his revenge. But before I get there, I do want to tell you about the Mr. M History podcast. Each week, we do a 1-hour rundown on some of the biggest parts of modern history. I'm joined by two of my mates, and they ask the questions that people might feel just too stupid to ask. For you guys, I'd recommend checking out our episode on the Julia Gillard years. Somehow BuzzFeed has convinced Gen Y that is Julia Gillard's key legacy. The one and only thing that Julia Gillard did was that speech.
Like, I feel like I never understood the context of it until now. It just sounded, or it was positioned in a way that it was just her just, fighting for women, just for the love of it,
Again, link will be in the comments. Check it out on your commute or when you do the dishes or wherever you like to listen to your pods. Anyway, in what was a really poetic ending for both Abbott and Turnbull, climate change would end up being the issue that would sink them both. So by 2018, Turnbull had now been in for 3 years, and throughout that time, energy prices had risen by a fair amount. As the climate change liberal, many were calling for Turnbull to take action against the power companies, and this saw the beginning of something called the National Energy Guarantee.
Families need affordable energy. Small businesses need affordable energy. Everything we are doing is designed to put more money into the pockets of hard-working Australian families.
Essentially, the NEG would install emissions reduction targets for power companies, and should they fail to meet those targets, they could have their licence revoked. Turnbull emphasised that this was in order to meet those reductions targets that were signed at the Paris Climate Accords. When we remember that Abbott won a resounding victory in 2013 on ending the mining and the carbon tax, I think we can start to imagine why many in the party weren't all that keen on the NEG.
They saw any attempt to reduce emissions, particularly any attempt to comply with our Paris commitments, as being, surrendering to the climate gods or whatever Abbott was saying at the time.
I think the best thing we can do right now is pull out of the Paris Agreement, because it's Paris which is driving the so-called National Energy Guarantee.
Abbott would eventually press his case harder though. So one of the ways that leaders keep their backbenchers happy is that they often have backbench committee meetings where they hear their concerns. Technically, Abbott was qualified to be at these meetings because he didn't have a ministry, but hadn't really participated because this was seen as beneath him, being a former Prime Minister. Well, one of the backbenchers, a guy you might actually remember called Craig Kelly, brought him in.
And so Malcolm was presenting on the neg, and Tony cut him off and said, look, this is just merchant banker gobbledygook. And that caused a bit of a ruckus.
And Malcolm said, Tony, please don't cut me off.
If you just let me finish my sentence.
Tony from the back room says, well, Malcolm, you should let me finish my prime ministership.
Abbott wasn't the only one who opposed Turnbull. Peter Dutton was also another key one, and used this as a pretext to challenge Turnbull for leadership of the party. Turnbull staved him off 48 to 35, but agreed to drop the emissions reductions targets for the time being. Abbott went in on Turnbull for making a quote-unquote compromise of convenience. I actually listened to Turnbull's audiobook and I can't actually play it, but I do distinctly remember a chapter where Turnbull talked about Abbott's ambitions. According to Turnbull, he thought that Abbott wanted Dutton to run in 2018 to lose the election in 2019, in which a leadership vacuum would be created where he could step in and be the opposition leader, probably his best position. Although the first bill wasn't a success, like 2013, Morrison had pushed his supporters towards Dutton while he publicly declared loyalty to Turnbull.
Any leadership ambitions?
Me?
Yeah.
This is my leader.
There you go.
And I'm ambitious for him.
Knowing he'd lost a majority, Turnbull resigned. At this point, Morrison successfully challenged Dutton and won leadership for himself. But if Abbott did have intentions of becoming the opposition leader again in 2019, the election really couldn't have gone any worse for him. Not only did Morrison win the unwinnable election, but Abbott lost his own seat of Warringah, largely because his electorate simply didn't agree with his approach towards climate change. It's really poetic. Abbott's career at the top started and ended with environmental policy. But to learn more about the emissions trading scheme, which plummeted Abbott into party leadership, you need to know about Kevin Rudd. Click here to see not just what he did, but how America possibly orchestrated his demise.